Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Sophocles' play Electra. So Electra is an interesting play, partially because we have the most surviving plays from the Electra myth cycle. So the Electra story, the roots of the Electra story go back to actually the beginning of the Trojan War, when Agamemnon, one of the kings of Greece, who's basically the leader of the Greek force attacking Troy, has to sacrifice his oldest daughter, Iphigenia, because Artemis is upset with him. Talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. So he sacrifices Iphigenia, which very predictably pisses off his wife Clytemnestra. So when Agamemnon gets back from the Trojan War, interestingly enough, having brought his sex slave, the Trojan prophetess Cassandra, along with him, which I'm sure really made Clytemnestra much more comfortable with the situation. When he returns from the Trojan War, Clytemnestra and her lover Aegysthus murder him. Their daughter Electra sends away their infant son, somehow their infant son, even though Agamemnon's been at the Trojan War for 10 years. So that raises some questions in and of itself. But Orestes is a baby, and Electra, his older sister, sends him away because she's convinced that Clytemnestra is going to have him murdered, so he can't grow up to avenge his father. Electra sends him away so that he can grow up and avenge his father, which he does. So Orestes comes back. With Electra's help and encouragement, he murders Clytemnestra and Aegysthus, at which point he is driven mad by the Furies for having killed his mother. He flees across Greece, eventually ending up in Athens, where he goes on trial, with Apollo defending him and the Furies prosecuting, and Athena at the head of the jury. So we get this story probably most famously in Aeschylus Oresteia, but we also have Sophocles' Electra, we have an Electra play by Euripides, and then we have two plays about Iphigenia by Euripides as well, Iphigenia in Aulis and Iphigenia among the Taurians. So this is an extremely popular story, an extremely popular myth cycle, and we have a lot of plays surviving from it, so we know a tremendous amount about how ancient Greek playwrights thought about it. There's two things that really interest me about Sophocles' version. One is, I actually see some really kind of interesting echoes of Hamlet, which are not actually echoes because Electra premiered between 420 and 410 BCE, whereas Hamlet doesn't premiere until around 1600 CE. So there's quite a substantial time gap. But I think that some of the ideas and some of the opinions and the positions expressed in Electra are very similar to those in Hamlet. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. But more significantly, I think Sophocles gives us a great sense of irony here, because Electra's whole, and Orestes to a lesser extent, but Electra is really the star here. Electra's whole position is built on accusing Clytemnestra, and to a lesser extent Aegysthus, of things that Electra herself is guilty of. And I think Sophocles really sort of drives this point home. So I want to start with something that the chorus says and this is taking us back to the sort of echoes of Hamlet. And I'm going to keep saying echoes of Hamlet because I think that's an okay way to think about it, despite the temporal inconsistency there. So, Electra, at the beginning of the play, is basically in deep, deep mourning for her father, who was killed years earlier, like decades earlier. A decade, I think like 18 years, something like that. He was killed a good long while ago. And so, like Hamlet, she's still in mourning when basically everybody else has sort of moved on. And the chorus says, but no lamentation, no amount of earnest praying will raise your father from the marsh of Hades, which all must go through. To abandon reason, to drown in irreparable sorrow, is grief run wild, grief destroying, nor will it ever annul the hurt. So why are you so devoted to anguish? And then, shortly after that, Electra's sister, Chrysothemis, shows up, and basically she says the same kind of thing. Look, your situation wouldn't be that bad if you weren't just constantly banging on about how Clytemnestra and Aegysthus murdered our dad. You could have a much more comfortable life if you just didn't constantly go around telling them that you're their enemy. So there is this sort of cast off thy knighted cloak and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark kind of ethos here that's presented to Electra. And basically her response is, no, I'm not going to give up my exorbitant grief. I'm not going to give up my bloodthirsty desire for revenge simply because I think it's the right thing to do. So she has this fairly extended speech that I think is a good one, responding to the chorus a little bit later. She says, "Good women, I'm embarrassed that you think I overdo my pourings out of grief, but this grief is ineluctable, so bear with me. How could any woman of generous spirit behave otherwise, given the torments that I face, which are not waning, but flush in the springtide of their virulence? To begin with, I have to cope with my mother's enmity, the woman who gave me birth. Next, in my own home, I have to live cheek by jowl with my father's murderers. They are my masters, and it rests with them whether to give or to withhold. On top of that, can you imagine what it is like to see Aegysthus seated on my father's throne? To see him sporting the same regalia and pouring out libations on the very hearth at which he murdered him? And the crowning outrage, to see the assassin in my father's bed alongside my despicable mother, if indeed that concubine can be called a mother," and so on and so on. She goes on for a little while more. But the key sort of point here is that, again, like Hamlet, we have this dedication to grief and this set of causes around the father's murder. One thing that's interesting about Electra's position is that she doesn't really seem to understand who her father was. So this gets us into the irony of Sophocles' play. Electra's continually talking about how awesome Agamemnon was. Actually, he was kind of a dick. So at one point, Electra actually refers to him as that dearest of men resting now in Hades. But actually, he was a bastard. I mean, Clytemnestra, there's this great pair of speeches that I think really give an excellent sense of the agonistic conflict in this play. And according to Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, tragedy is structured around agonistic conflict. So basically, two competing ethical positions, each of which is potentially valid, struggle for supremacy. So Clytemnestra comes on, and basically she gives us the complaint. She gives us the critique that she makes of Electra's behavior for 18 years or so. In the midst of this very lengthy speech, she says, "It's your father, always your father. Yes, I killed him, I know that, no need to deny it. I and Justice were the killers, the goddess Justice, and you would agree with her if you could think. This father of yours you're forever whining about decided all on his own out of all the Greeks to sacrifice your sister to the gods. He wasn't the one to go through agony when I gave her birth. So tell me, for whom did he sacrifice her for? For the Greeks, you say? But who gave them the right to kill what was mine? Did he kill what was mine to help his brother Menelaus? Then Menelaus should pay the price." So again, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia. He does not tell Clytemnestra that he's going to do that beforehand, so that's probably a questionable decision. Then, at the end of the Trojan War, he brings back a sex slave from Troy. He's a bastard. I mean, he's not a good guy, despite Electra's sort of illusion that he is. And then, interestingly, Electra gives an extended response in which she defends Agamemnon and critiques Clytemnestra. And this is where the irony really picks up, because most of the defenses that Electra makes and most of the critiques she makes of Clytemnestra apply equally to her and Orestes. So, in saying that, so first Electra takes up the concern about who gave Agamemnon permission to sacrifice Iphigenia, and basically she says Artemis demanded that Agamemnon pay the price because of a thing that he had done. Like he in mythology he kills a deer and he's basically like, haha, I'm so much better of a hunter than Artemis, goddess of the hunt. And Artemis is like, yeah, well, now I'm going to make you sacrifice your daughter at the beginning of the Trojan War, or you can't have any wind to sail to Troy. So, I mean, in the sense that Artemis forces this choice, it's not Agamemnon's decision, but this is an ironic defense because it's premised on Agamemnon's hubris. I mean, the story of Agamemnon offending Artemis is a story about him being arrogant, him basically saying, I'm better than the gods, which was a big problem in Greek mythology and in tragedy especially. So Electra's defense of him is not really a good defense. Then she goes on, she asks Clytemnestra, even if it was to help him, is that sufficient reason for you to murder him? That's if the sacrifice of Iphigenia had been to help Menelaus, is that sufficient reason for you to murder Agamemnon? By what law? If you start inventing laws to suit humanity, take care you don't invent for yourself pain and remorse. Because if we were swapping life for life and you got what you deserved, you'd be the first to die. Electra's whole existence seems to be premised around plotting the murder of Clytemnestra and Aegysthus. So saying violence should be met with violence, death should be met with death, and that's so it's bad to kill because you should be killed in turn. Like, that's Electra's thing, is she wants to kill her mother and her mother's lover. Along the same lines, toward the end of this speech, she says, what of that other, the luckless Orestes, wearing out his unhappy days in exile, who only just escaped your clutches? You've often accused me of nurturing him to punish you, and I would have done so, to be sure of that, had I had the power. So again, we've got this defense that's ironically not a defense at all, because she says, your accusation is that I want Orestes to come and murder you. Well, I do want Orestes to come and murder you. So again, she's not really, like, if she's saying, I'm innocent of the things you accuse me of, she's not. She's in fact guilty of the things that Clytemnestra accuses her of, and she's guilty of the same desire for violent revenge that she critiques in Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon to take revenge for Iphigenia's murder / sacrifice, and Electra wants to kill Clytemnestra and Aegysthus to take revenge for Agamemnon's murder. They're in exactly the same position, and yet Electra insists on the evil of Clytemnestra's actions and the justice of her own, while Clytemnestra insists on the justice of Clytemnestra's actions and the injustice of Electra's desires. The one critique, I think, that Electra makes in this lengthy speech is that Clytemnestra has taken Aegysthus as a lover. And that's fair. I mean, there's nothing particularly in this idea of justice for Agamemnon, or justice against Agamemnon from Clytemnestra's perspective, that suggests she should be having sex with Aegysthus. That being said, it's also quite fair that Agamemnon had sex with a number of other people he wasn't married to, including his sex slave Cassandra, who he brings back from the Trojan Wars. Whether that's a justification or not is an open question, and I don't think Sophocles is as concerned about that. I think he's more interested in this question of the irony of Electra using violence as revenge for violence that's been used as revenge. And we get this especially at the end. The final sort of scene of the play, Orestes has returned, and he goes in to he and his friend Pylades, who basically just is there for no good reason. He has no lines, he's just a supporting character. So they go in to murder Clytemnestra in the palace, and the scene is really reminiscent of the scene in Aeschylus Oresteia, in Aeschylus's play Agamemnon, the first play of the Oresteia trilogy, where Clytemnestra and Aegysthus murder Agamemnon. So Electra is outside, the chorus is outside. It says, "A cry is heard from within the palace." That's a stage direction Paul Roach has put in here. Paul Roach is the translator of this Signet Classics edition. We hear Clytemnestra cry out, my son, have pity on your mother." And Electra says, "You had no pity on him or his father." Then a little bit later, Clytemnestra cries out, "Ah, I am struck." And Electra says, "Strike again if you have the power." So Electra is very clearly bloodthirsty here. Like, she's hearing this violent murder of her mother, and she's basically sort of cheering Orestes on and saying, kill her more. And she actually says, "Blood for the blood that was spilled from those so long ago." And again, this is that irony of Sophocles, that violent revenge is being met with violent revenge. But we have this sort of this repeated pattern when Aegysthus shows up, because he was out visiting the countryside or something like that. And Orestes basically says, "No, I'm not going to kill you outside the palace. I'm going to make you go inside the palace to where you killed Agamemnon, so I'm going to kill you there." So again, we have this very direct mirroring of the murder of Agamemnon, with Orestes even staging it in the same place that Agamemnon's murder took place. So we have, again, this clear repetition in Sophocles that what Orestes and Electra are doing is not fundamentally different than what Clytemnestra and Aegysthus had done. And then almost the last lines of the play, Orestes says, "Swift justice should overtake every criminal act. Death to all who decide to flout the law, then the prevalence of crime would be no more." Again, this is super ironic because, again, he has just murdered his mother and her lover. He has just committed a crime, and indeed, the Furies do pursue him. Like, he is in fact driven mad by the Furies because he murders Clytemnestra. But part of the irony is, at least in the Aeschylus version, and I think there's different versions of Orestes' end, but in the Aeschylus version that most people would be familiar with, Orestes actually isn't killed for this crime. He is actually basically let off the hook in the trial at Athens. So, and the Oresteia would probably have been familiar. Aeschylus' version probably would have been familiar to theater-going audiences seeing Sophocles' version of Electra. So he could build that irony of using violence as revenge for violence and pretending that you have an ethically superior position.